In the 1950s, political coverage was closely managed and far more restricted than it is today. The BBC took a softly attitude towards coverage of general elections. In 1959, the election was barely mentioned in nightly news bulletins, and the quest to maintain disinterested impartiality meant that even the current affairs flagship, Panorama, made no reference to it at all. However, as polling day drew near, the BBC did acknowledge the election in its regional programmes. Each separate BBC region produced 2 editions of a programme called Hustings, presented by their own independent chairman. All except Northern Ireland, which had its own particular political tensions even then. In each programme, 3 local party representatives would face questions from an audience invited by the political parties themselves. All questions were submitted in advance. Due to the way the BBC used to manage the archiving of its programmes, only the London editions of Hustings remain today. Let's join Derek Hart in South London. Close your eyes and we could be watching Question Time.
Tonight we present simultaneously from regional centres all over the country the second BBC Hustings programme on election issues. In the South East region, the programme comes from a BBC studio in Lime Grove, London, where representatives of the 3 main political parties, with an independent chairman, are waiting to answer questions from an audience of people who live south of the River Thames. The independent chairman is Derek Hart.
Well, good evening. On the same platform tonight we have 3 speakers, each nominated by his party to be their spokesman. We also have an audience made up of people who hold strong political views. They are equally represented, and there are also a number of people here who are politically uncommitted. Now, members of this audience have submitted questions, and the producer and I have sifted through them and made our selection, but the questioners do not yet know whether or not they will be called, nor have we shown the speakers what the questions are. The speakers on the platform for the Liberals, John Baker. He's a solicitor, 14 years a Liberal. He's a member of the Liberal Party executive. He's married and he's got 1 daughter. The Labour spokesman is Ian Mikardo. He's vice chairman of the Labour Party. He was first returned to Westminster 14 years ago. He's married, he has 2 daughters and 2 grandsons. The Conservative spokesman is Harold Watkinson. He's the Minister of Transport. He's first entered the House of Commons 9 years ago. He's married and he has 2 daughters. Now, the first question I call Mr. Whitlock.
Mr. Chairman, are the speakers finding that their opponents are fighting a fair and clean election campaign?
Watkinson.
Yes, I think most of our elections are fought that way. I think we in the Conservative Party would claim that there's not quite enough of the real facts of our opponents' policies being presented, but then no doubt they would say the same of us. I certainly would say that this election is not breaking any of the long traditions of our ordinary democratic elections.
Does Labour agree with that, Mikardo?
Well, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I've no complaint at all. I happened to meet my opponent in a train just before the election started, and he said to me, let's have a good, clean fight, and I said, jolly good, let's do that. And I must say he's done exactly what he said. Unfortunately, however, he had a bit of embarrassment, because for his very first meeting, Lord Hailsham came to Reading and spent all his time making a personal, rather smeary attack on me, and my poor opponent had to sit through it all, terribly embarrassed listening to it all. But then, of course, that's not his fault, and I don't blame him for it at all.
Baker, what do you feel about this?
Well, I would say by and large that things have gone. As the questioner indicated, the campaign has been fair and clean. I thought that the exchange of letters between Mr. Morgan Phillips on the one side and Lord Hailsham on the other wasn't particularly illuminating, but I don't think that's typical of the campaign as a whole.
Anything further, Watkinson?
Well, of course, this campaign is going to be won or lost on the doorsteps I think people are a bit bored with the telly, if I may stick my neck out, because they can't answer it back. Certainly I find my meetings well attended and people anxious to ask questions, as I hope they are here tonight. And I think that's the way, in the end, the election will be won or lost all over the country.
Well, I wouldn't say that people are bored with the television. What I would say is that it hasn't played quite such a prominent part, to the exclusion of other things, that certain commentators thought it would. I believe that the attendance at meetings has been good by and large, but that doesn't mean to say, as Watkinson seems to think, that people are bored with the telly. I think the two are quite complementary.
Mikardo?
What I found in this election is two things. One is, to go back to the question we were asked, that nothing damages a candidate more than to play dirty tricks in an election. And it's jolly good that that should be so, and it's a tribute to our electorate that it is so. And I think the few chaps who do chuck things about are only damaging their own cause. The second thing is, I've found, knocking on a lot of doors lately, and I've been knocking on a lot, that people are taking this election much more seriously than any of the previous four I've fought. They really are thinking it out. I'm not quite sure how far their thinking out has been contributed to by the television. Some of them say it has. But certainly, in one way or another, they are thinking the issues out much harder than I ever remember before.
Right. Now, next question from Mr. Henry Blandford.
Where are the Socialist Party going to find £600 or £700 million to implement the pledges in its election manifesto?
Oh, dead easy, dead easy.
Well, Mr. Mikardo, where?
Item 1. We won't waste £328 million on a Suez campaign. Item 2, we shall save the £233 million which we're paying extra interest on the national debt as a result of the Tories' high interest policy, and we get not a penny for that 233 millions. Item 3, we shall get the 450 millions of extra revenue which we would have had if our economy hadn't stagnated in the 3 years from 1955 and 1958. Item 4, we shall catch some of these tax-free expenses, and item 5, we shall impose a capital gains tax. Add that lot up, it pays for the programme twice over.
Conservative
Well,
view.
it may, if you accept the addition, but nonetheless, it doesn't include, for example, the municipalisation of all rented houses, which I gather is still in the programme. And of course, there's something much more important than this. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, I want to try and stick to some basic facts tonight. This planned increase in production, I want to know more about it. Because if you're going to increase production at home without increasing exports to pay for the extra raw materials you will need, then we're headed for an even bigger inflation than we had last time we had a socialist government.
I really don't follow the last remark of Watkinson's, but he seems to think that there can't be an increase in production. I would have thought that there's plenty of capacity in our factories and throughout our whole industrial setup for a considerable increase in production. Of course, that means you've got to import more, but the terms of trade have been in our favour in recent years, and we can hope that that can continue.
But really, come. I mean, do you really think that Sir Leonard Lord and the British Motor Car Corporation isn't selling every motor car abroad he can? And do you really think that all the other great companies on which our export trade is founded aren't doing all they can to sell abroad? You know, that's absolutely nonsense.
The proof of the pudding... Wait a minute, take it easy. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The plain fact of the matter is that other countries go on increasing their national production every year. And we do it under a Tory government in fits and starts. 4 years ago, Mr. Butler said double our standard of living in 25 years. And in the first 3 years, we didn't take a step. It's like trying to run a mile race, sprinting madly for 100 yards and then stopping still for 10 minutes. And you're never going to get to the end. The plain fact of the matter is that in the 8 years the Conservatives have been in power, the 17 Western European countries of OEEC have put up their national output 31%. The 6 common market countries, who are our big competitors, have put up their national output combined 42%, and Great Britain's gone up 14%.
But I think
That's the cold, hard facts of the
I
situation.
think we ought just to be careful about this. You see, the issue isn't how much you can put up your production at home. That's very easy to do. The issue is, if you put it up at home, how do you pay for the increased raw materials which you then have to bring in to keep your factories going? And therefore, I say again, it is not a scrap of use of putting up production at home, planned or otherwise, unless you can show quite clearly how you're going to get immediately a very large step up in exports. You're certainly not going to get it by taking over 600 of the large firms that are doing the exporting themselves.
I think Watkinson's far too pessimistic about it. Surely, if we get our imported supplies, we can have enough confidence in ourselves that we can produce goods at a proper competitive price which we can export.
You know, sometimes I think that the Conservatives ought to make up their mind which of two horses they're riding. The last day or two, they've been taking great joy out of the fact that production went up in August. It's the one swallow that doesn't make a summer. But do you want it to go up or don't you want it to go up? Just now you said it was terrible if it went up. And the second horse they ought to make up their mind about is this. They say we mustn't increase production only to consume it at home. Then why on earth do they start a hire purchase boom, encouraging everybody at home to absorb the raw materials that our exporters need for their exports?
Well, of course,
they really ought to make up their minds about this one.
Well, we're still waiting for the answer, which is quite vital to everybody who works in British industry, and that is how, in the present competitive state of the world, are we going to get an immediate and enormous increase in exports? And I'm still waiting for somebody to answer that question. And if you can't answer it, then you have no right to say that you can mop up enormous increases in expenditure by an expansion in production. The only way we live in the world is by selling goods to people who, on the whole, won't take them if they're not right for price and quality, and everybody really knows that. And so the key to all this is not at home, it's how we live outside in the world.
Right, let's move on now. David Penwarden.
What is the real answer to wildcat strikes, such as the recent one at British Oxygen?
Mikardo.
Well, the real answer, I think, is better industrial relations. And I want to say this at once. I don't think that this is a question of politics or a matter for government or opposition or anything else. I've been a trade unionist as long as I've been qualified to join a trade union, and I've been a member of the executive of a union for years. And I don't want to see government interference in industrial relations at all, or political implications in industrial relations. There is an answer to wildcat strikes, which is to have better communications between men and management, and to have quicker settlement of disputes, especially settlement on a local basis without it having to go through all the bureaucracy of the employers' organisations and the trade union movement.
Watkinson.
I think...
Well, I think it's nice to be able to have something on which certainly I don't think Mikardo and I will differ. But I would just like to say something which is not in any sense a political comment. I do hope these men in British Oxygen, who before long are going to stop large sections of British industry, would just consider this question, because I'm quite sure I can tell them who's going to win the strike. Our foreign customers are going to win the strike. Our foreign competitors are going to win the strike, because they'll be very happy to supply our foreign customers with the goods which we can't supply them with. And I just hope every man now out on strike will very sincerely think about that issue.
To have a liberal voice on.
Well, the short answer is better management, but there's an ancillary to that, and that is that I'm quite certain there will be less strikes of this nature if more people who are employed in great undertakings had a share in them and a share in their prosperity.
I must say, whilst I agree with the first half of what Baker said, and with all that Harold Watkinson said, I don't agree with the second half. We do need better management in British industry. unfortunately, it's all too easy to get a managerial job in British industry without exhibiting any qualifications for it. That's less true than it was, but it's still true, and it's a great pity. And a great pity.
Politicians.
But I don't. Certainly,
That's a very fair point.
Certainly, but you must remember you don't choose politicians to be technicians. You choose them as a cross-section of ordinary bods. So we're no cleverer than you, and you can't ask for that. But where Baker, I think, is wrong is his suggestion that ownership improves industrial relations. I'm sorry to say that all the experience goes to show, unfortunately, that that isn't so. If there were an easy answer like that, it would be lovely, but there isn't.
I'm not saying that this is an easy answer. I'm saying that it is part of the answer. And I'm quite convinced that the more people who have a stake in the undertaking in which they work, in forms of shares or other incentives and bonuses and so on, the more responsibly they will act, because they are bound up with the welfare of the organization which employs them.
Anything further?
I hope, anyway, the answer to this question, and I think it's from all of us, is that these men ought to go back to work tomorrow.
And I call Mrs. Sedman.
I'm an independent, and I want to know if the speakers have the courage to admit their own party's biggest mistakes since the war.
Oh, yes, I'll do that. I'll do that with pleasure. I'll do that with the greatest of pleasure. I think there were two that I have particularly in mind. One was the launching of the £4,700 million rearmament programme in 1951. You'll remember, Watkinson, we both spoke in the debate on that particular debate in July 51. The other, I think, was to support by a very narrow majority the rearmament of Western Germany.
What's the Conservatives' biggest blunder, Mr. Watkinson?
Well, gentlemen, says we're still making it. He's drawn a pretty good dividend on Conservative rule in the last 8 years. I don't suppose he's repudiated that. No, I think our biggest mistake, probably, was that when we were defeated in 1945, we were a bit slow in reshaping our whole program. But we came to it, and we brought forward, in the end, a completely new kind of conservatism. And frankly, I wouldn't be in the House of Commons or in the Cabinet at the moment if we hadn't done that. And the thing that amazes me is, frankly, why the Socialist Party hasn't thought up a new solution, too, to some of the problems, like nationalisation, which I'm quite sure, on the whole, the country really repudiates.
That is another issue.
Could we have the question? Let's hear the Liberal.
Yes, I'm going to say this, that until Joe Grimond came to the leadership of the Liberal Party, it had no definite political position. We were fighting on a wide diversity of interests, mainly economic. I don't disagree with that, but what I think is important is to have a long-term aim. And Joe Grimond has said, and this has been endorsed by the party, that our long-term aim is to replace the Labour Party as the radical alternative to Conservative.
You know, Derek, the questioner said she was an independent and she wanted a frank answer. Watkinson answered that question about the mistakes of the Conservatives without mentioning Suez or Central Africa. I mentioned two things much more serious and damaging than that. And she and the rest of this audience and all the viewers can judge who's answered the question frankly and who hasn't.
Because if we're going to go into a competitive argument on who made the biggest mistakes, then I'm not sure the viewers will be very interested, or I hope the audience, because what I hope they're more interested in is what are we going to do in the next 5 years, not what did we do in the last 20.
The important thing is to admit where you're wrong.
Well, try and put it right.
If you're wrong.
What about Suez? Wasn't that wrong? You withdrew.
I think we withdrew. Any further comment from any of
the audience have a go.
You withdrew.
You can answer this one back.
Was not going forward.
Mr. Blaisby. Can I have a question from Mr. Blaisby, please?
Oh, you make bigger ones than that.
What steps would you take to ensure a reasonable and stable cost of living for people with fixed incomes and low incomes, especially old age pensioners and people with large families?
Well, I think the answer to that's quite clear, that you must have a basic old age pension tied to the cost of living.
Mikardo? Right, Watkinson.
Again, are we being realistic in these arguments? Because if the present old age pension was tied to the cost of living, it would be several shillings less than it already is.
Yes, I said a realistic
Mikardo.
It has advanced ahead of the rise in the cost of living.
Well, you know, Watkinson, you better go and tell that to some old age pensioners and see what they say about it. But you see, what Baker said to start with, think what he said, I agree with what he said. He said you've got to start with a realistic figure and then tie it to the cost of living. But then, of course, and I agree with him, and that's what we propose to do. We propose to raise it immediately and then tie it to the cost of living. And the Conservatives refuse to do that. But that's not the whole of the answer to the question we were asked, because other people besides old age pensioners are affected. And of course, keeping the cost of living stable is important for many sections of the community, if not for all. And let me say frankly at once, this isn't something which is going to be easy for any government.
Watkinson.
Sorry, go on, you finish.
I was just going to say, it isn't easy for any government. To some extent, we're dependent upon import prices and so on. But I think, to be very brief, there are a few things one can do. I think we ought to limit the right of people to import what they like, when they like, for what currency they like, pay what they like. Sure. I think we can reduce a lot of middlemen, especially in food distribution, and I think we can impose some quality standards, because higher quality for the same money is one way of cutting the cost of goods.
Mikardo is talking as if the cost of living is still rushing away. Of course, it's been stable for the last 18 months. And the Conservative Party is clearly pledged to keep it that way. And we think we've shown how to do it. And that is the greatest prize that any government can give to its people. A stable cost of living and therefore an honest value of their money. And that helps the pensioner.
Sorry, I wasn't finished. I beg pardon.
And that helps the pensioner and everybody. And let's at least stick to that fact, that it has at least been stable for 18 months. Nobody can challenge that. And no doubt any new government wants to keep it that way. There's no difference between us on that. All we say is we've shown how to do it for 18 months, and therefore we have, I think, some right to say we can do it in the future.
Well, look, Mr. Macmillan said let's stick to the facts. I'm willing. I'm willing. The facts are as follows. In the 8 years since October 1951, when the government came to power, the cost of the food we import on world markets has dropped by 3 shillings in the pound. In the same time, the prices you pay for food have risen by 8 shillings in the pound. They're the facts.
Oh, yes, of course they are, but quite a different set of facts.
Now then. You know, the more that Mikardo and Watkinson go on talking like this, the more people are going to vote Liberal.
Where they've got a Liberal candidate, which isn't everywhere.
I'm rather surprised at what Mikardo has said by way of a remedy to the situations. The 3 things he put forward were, 1, a limitation on imports. Now, who's going to do the limiting and on what grounds? Secondly, a reduction of middlemen. Now, who's going to do the reducing and who would he define as middlemen? And secondly, there's going to be an imposition of quality standards. But of course, in the last resort, there are a number of those by various trade organizations. What worries me is that Mikardo recognizes the danger with regard to the brittleness of his economy, of our economy, yet all his remedies are restrictive, whereas the Liberal view is that we need, as I said earlier on, we need a greater expansion of production and a removal of restrictions.
After all, if you want to stick to the facts are, it's stable at the moment. The choice for you, ladies and gentlemen, is who do you think is most likely to keep it stable? It's your choice, not mine. But don't let's argue that it's not stable at the moment, because it is. And your choice is, which kind of government do you think will keep it stable for the sake of your families and your children and the country as a whole. But it's your choice.
That we shall see next week.
Yeah.
Can I now have a question from Mr. Stevens?
How are the Conservatives going to double the standard of living, preserve the value of the pound, and keep prices stable, all at the same time?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you'll be delighted to hear there's a nice short answer to this one. And it is this: by basing our faith and our policies on the virtue of true private enterprise that has made our country great and that will keep it great if we go on that way.
Well, I don't know why you asked me this question. I'm not responsible for the Conservative Party. But I must say that Watkinson has just given birth to the woolliest lump of verbiage I have heard in 5 election campaigns. And if that's what he means by a practical policy, we know where we stand. It's wishful thinking.
Oh, yeah. Well, just one quick comment on that, if I may. All right. If that is so, if it is untrue that private enterprise provides our exports and thus earns our keep in the world, if that's an untrue statement, then what does provide our export trade and what does earn our living in a very hard and competitive world?
Private enterprise. I think that both Mikardo and Watkinson here are taking too broad a view and too doctrinaire an outlook. It seems to me that, of course, private enterprise has achievements to its credit. No one would deny that, not even the most extreme socialist. But what we've got to see is that all forms of wealth and productive wealth are allowed to increase their capacity. And that's what Mikardo, to some extent, and myself to a greater extent tonight, have been saying through this discussion. What I hope Watkinson will do as a corollary of what he said is to see that the restrictive practices on both sides of industry by employers and trade unions are really attacked in the next Parliament.
As far as the government is concerned, I don't think anybody can accuse us of not being pretty tough on monopolies. Well, of course, I'll take you up on that. The gentleman who's shouting takeover bid. I'll tell you the biggest takeover bid in our history is promised by the Socialist Party to take over the shares of the 600 companies who are keeping our country prosperous. That's the biggest takeover bid.
You know these... Hi, let's get a word in. You know... You see how terribly sensitive these Tories are about takeover bids? Because, you see, this is the trouble. You talk about freedom from controls and letting private enterprise go on and so on. It sounds pretty, but you can't have complete freedom from controls. Watkinson, if you tried to drive your car down the right-hand side of Oxford Street, you'd soon find out there are some controls. And those controls are there to... And those controls are there to stop people crashing. And what happens when you take off controls is that you get crashes. And the takeover bid is merely the natural extension of freedom from controls. This mad speculative fever in the city is a natural extension of freedom from controls.
Well, may I just ask one question, which I've been longing to ask Mikardo for a long time. I'm asking him a question. Does he and his party then still stick to what he said they would do about 2 years ago, and that is that they would take over at the earliest possible moment the shareholding of 600 of our major British companies? I would like to know the answer, and I still think it's a takeover bid.
Yeah. You know, poor old Watkinson's very disappointed. He thought somebody in the audience was going to ask that question. He's been
I still got it in.
And it didn't come out, and he got it in. He got it in.
And you give me the answer.
And I'll give you the answer with the greatest of pleasure. Although, of course, you know the answer. And this is a trick question.
I don't.
Yeah, this is a trick question. I'm about to. Don't worry, I'm not afraid of this one. I wrote an article which Watkinson is quoting several weeks before the 1957 conference of the Labour Party, in which I advocated a certain course of action which he is quoting as being the course which I would like to see that conference adopt as Labour Party policy. They didn't choose to adopt it. and therefore it's not the policy of the Labour Party, and Watkinson knows it perfectly well, and so does Lord Hailsham, and they ought to stop scratching this little itch and trying to make a sore out of it.
Let's have a Liberal on.
I'm going to have a word in now. Because we're a long way from the original question, but they've got irrelevant as usual, so we'll deal with this matter of takeover bids in this way. I suggest to Mr. Watkinson that he might well cast his mind back to an answer that I gave a little time ago about industrial democracy, and that is this: that where your shareholders are to a great extent divorced altogether from having any direct participation in the company, there indeed you get a company that is vulnerable to financial speculation. If there was an extension of shareholding by those people who worked in factories and in other industrial undertakings, they would have a direct interest in it, and I think the atmosphere would be totally different.
Could I say a word about that? You see, I agree with what Baker said. I don't think Watkinson would disagree either. It's a good thing for people to have a stake in their own business. But really to imagine that in the mid-20th century, with great aggregations of economic power in a few firms, that the whole of British industry can go that way is really a liberal 19th century pipe dream. The fact is that modern technological advance means that industry is run in big units and there's no getting away from. That's not political. That's the result purely of technological advance.
What about ICI?
I'm not saying that the only financial interest in a big public company can come from those that work in it. That, of course, would be a ridiculous proposition, and I've never put it forward. What I have said is that those who work there and are responsible for management have at least some stake in the undertaking which employs them. I think that will create a better atmosphere and lead to better working relationships. And on that, I would say that that's not old-fashioned, but that is right up to date.
I feel there should be a very large prize for anybody who remembers the original question. Mr. Gladwin.
Question to Mr. Mikardo. What do you think is the best contribution Great Britain can make to the summit conference?
Well, I don't know why you should ask only me that. I'd like to hear my two colleagues answering that question as well. I think the best contribution we can make is to do two things. One is to go there with independent ideas and a policy idea instead of tagging along behind other people. I'm afraid we've tagged along much too much behind other people since the war. I'm not making a party point out of this. I think it was true during the period of the Labour government to some extent. It's even more true at the present time that we've been too much influenced by the Americans, I think. Now, of course, we're tagging along behind Dr. Adenauer as well, because Herr von Eckart, the spokesman of the German federal government, said a little while ago, and no British government spokesman has denied it, that they had had an understanding from our government that we wouldn't do anything to offend the Bonn government. The second contribution we could make is to send to a summit conference people who haven't lost the trust and confidence of the world through violating the United Nations Charter at Suez.
Conservative view, Mr. Watkinson.
I take it, Mr. Chairman, we are all allowed to answer this question. Because I'd like to. You know, I don't think anybody in this country, we all live under the threat of a hydrogen war, and we all want to stop it. There are no party differences there. And I'd like to say right away, I don't doubt the sincerity of the leaders of the two other parties at all in this matter, or their, no doubt, sincere feeling that they are the right people. Certainly Mr. Gateskill, I'm sure, feels that, to go to a summit meeting. But I must just make this point. You're going to go to a very tough session. And whatever Mikardo may say about agreeing or disagreeing with the Americans, and of course my view is that America is our ally, and you don't break from your ally when you're facing a very tough opposition. But apart from that, the point I want to make is this, and it's a difficult point, I think. I'm frankly not clear whether the Socialist Party has one policy on disarmament or two. I'm not clear whether, for example, they believe that they should now renounce the bomb altogether, unilaterally, break with NATO and our allies, or whether the non-nuclear club is the right answer. Now, I'd only say this, that if they want to go to the summit...
Mr. Watkinson, may I interrupt you here? What you were actually asked was, what do you think is the best contribution Great Britain can make to the summit conference?
Send Mr. Harold Macmillan. Send Mr. Harold Macmillan. You want it in 3 ways?
Mr. Baker, let's have the Liberals.
Well, you know, what is important is not really who goes on behalf of this country. And may I remind both Mr. Mikardo and Mr. Watkinson that they go not to represent their parties, but they go to represent the country as a whole. But what is important is what they're going to say when they get there. And I would have thought that the best contribution that this country can make may not be at the actual summit conference itself, but in the preparatory work beforehand. Because one of the things that seems to have been falling apart in the last 18 months or so is any form of common policy between the Western powers. And I'd like to see this country to take the lead, in particularly at NATO, politically as well as militarily, to try and bring about a much more united Western policy before we get to the summit. And in that, Great Britain has a very important role to play.
I think there's one point which arises out of what we've been saying. I think it's very important that whoever goes to the summit from each of the countries should be a reasonably flexible person, a person who is willing to have a bit of give and take and willing to rethink the problem in the light of the situation as it develops. My complaint against the leaders of our present government on this subject, I give them full credit for their sincerity, as Watkinson did to other people, I'm sure that's right, but my complaint against them is this, that not only are they tarnished with the brush of a violation of the UN Charter, but that they seem to have been terribly rigid all the time. They've got an idea and they stick to it through thick and thin, even through a changing situation. And one thing I do think I can fairly claim as credit for the leaders of my party, that they're trying to think this thing out all the time and to show a flexible approach to meet changing situations.
I'm sure they are. But really, if it is really thought that starting with Mr. Macmillan's mission to Moscow and the whole concept of trying to talk it out instead of shoot it out, if really people will believe that Mr. Macmillan hasn't been flexible and indeed I think a very clever negotiator, well then frankly I think we're not talking the same language at all.
Last word from the Liberal on this.
I really don't think Mr. Watkinson is talking language that's in conformity with the facts. To suggest for one moment that when Mr. Macmillan went to Moscow earlier this year, he brought about a total change in the Russian ideas, as he said, from shooting it out to talking it out, seems to me to be a gross exaggeration. I would have thought that if the Russians wanted to shoot it out, they would have done so in the years, say, 1948, at the time of the Berlin crisis, and would have exploited additional advantages in Europe, but they haven't done so. I think that it is totally wrong to say that to take the credit for any achievements that there may be in the take all the credit for those achievements, any that there may be in this direction, and in any event, I think that to suggest that the Russians were prepared to shoot it out before Mr. Macmillan went to Moscow is totally wrong.
Gentlemen, I can finish on this one, I think, now, Mr. Watkinson. I want to one last question from Mr. Evan Hawken.
Well, I must just say that, of course, I did not say that the Russians were prepared to shoot it out when Mr. Macmillan went to Moscow, and that must clearly go on the record.
History has proved that a strong third party has been advantageous to the House of Commons. Do the speakers here tonight agree that this would also be the case today?
A strong third party in the House of Commons, advantageous to the House of Commons. Do you all agree that this will be the case today, Mr. Watkinson?
No, I certainly don't. The House of Commons was built for two parties, sitting opposite one another. Her Majesty's opposition, and that's the way it ought to stay.
Mikardo?
I think it doesn't matter what Watkinson and Baker and I think about this.
No.
We shan't decide.
No.
What matters is what the nation thinks about it. And the fact is that the British people like the two-party system. When they, you'll find out next week. You'll find out next week. When they go to a football match, they like to be either for the home team or the away team.
Baker, let's
May I remind before you blow your whistle, Mr. Terror, may I remind Mr. Carter that a general election is not a football match, and that there's never been a time in the history of our House of Commons when there has been a rigid division between two parties.
Well, I never thought we'd end this program with agreement between you and Mikardo.
I'm very glad of it. What I was going to say when I was cut into was this. It is the attitude of the average Briton. He wants to know where he stands. He says, them as ain't for me is against me. And he wants to see the issue clear cut. I'm not saying whether he's right or wrong. I might like to have a sizable Liberal party, but the ordinary elector clearly doesn't want it, whether the Liberals like it or not.
Well, I'm not surprised that Watkinson and Mikardo should end up on the same note in agreement, and they'll find, I believe, next week that a lot of people think that there ought to be an increase in the vote of those who are against both the Labour Party on the one hand and the Conservatives on the other.
You know, Baker, it was George Eliot who said that prophecy is the most gratuitous form of error.
And on that note, we will end the programme for tonight. We thank the...
What do you want if you don't want money? What do you want if you don't want gold? Say what you want and I'll give it you, darling. Wish you wanted my love, baby.